couple of minutes. So you will see on screens, we have three gentlemen here, very good looking. Andrew Layton and also Sir Constantine, and my name is Jeffrey Tay. I'll be hosting the webinar today. Mainly my job is just to ask critical and serious questions, challenge the presenters, and also facilitate any questions today. So I can now see a number of people are logging in, to join this webinar right now. So we're going to wait for a few more minutes before we kickstart presentations as well as all the discussions that are important for today. Before we kickstart, let's just basically have a friendly chat with our presenter here this morning. Also, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask, feel free to drop your question or write your question at the Ask Questions button, or you can actually put it on the Say Something Nice column. We also have polls for you to vote. That's just an exercise that allows us to know what's important to you and for us. And also, most importantly, we want to doesn't want to feel alone talking to our own computer. For those who just joined us, if you could just say good morning or hello at the Say Something Nice column, so that we know that you're here and we're not alone. Because these days, stuck at home, I'm from home, so work from home for almost 4 months. The new war is my best friend. Once I get to go out, I was like, wow, humans are kind of nice. All right, we have more people logging in right now, so we're just gonna wait. Good morning, Nigel. Hey. How are you?
Yeah, good day, Nigel. Mohan. I was going to say, I think I'm going to need one of your backgrounds there, Jeffrey. My one's a little bit on the blank side.
I have to, ladies and gentlemen, because as our organization holds a number of cybersecurity and obviously identity access management webinar, we try to use the blank wall. I actually try to host this at home. There's a lot of echoing or anything like that. So we spend a bit of money just to basically put a soundproof wall and absorb thing to make sure that the quality goes right. And I also have the huge light in front of me so that I don't look dark or anything. Usually after the webinar, I need to eye conditioning on my eyes.
Nice.
Throughout the last 3 months, we have a total of, I think, 2,000 something new registrants join us, which I think hopefully we're planning September, October, November, we start doing live event again. All right, without further ado, I think we still have a lot of people logging in right now. So I think we're going to kickstart, okay? Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to today's webinar, bouncing back from disruption. Disruption, we talk about this, not just the pandemic crisis. There's a lot of disruptions around the world, as we know of. And I don't think this will stop anytime soon. There's also a number of organizations that take this crisis and also disruption as the lessons to build and strengthen their cybersecurity strategy. So today we have Andrew Layton, Senior Regional Solutions Architect from Ping Identity, Asia Pacific. It's also a IT security veteran practicing certified information system security professional, CISSP. I think when Andrew started to do IAM, I think I just started to be able to stand in front of a bottle shop using a fake ID to buy alcohol. Okay?
I'm not that old. The grey shows it, but yes, absolutely. I'm not sure if you were actually born yet, but yeah, it has been a long time.
So he spent almost 20 years in corporate business and technology role in multiple industry. If you check out his LinkedIn, he's spent a vast amount of time helping organizations building their identity access management system and cybersecurity system as well. Obviously, on our left or whatever, your right, whichever screen you're using, we have Sir Constantine, the Technical Director for One Identity, APJ. Now, Sir Khan is a bit of a celebrity, I would say, because he not just conferences, but webcasts, podcasts, and he wrote a number of articles in magazine columns, etc., on cybersecurity. Sekhan himself spent the last 17 years on identity access management as well. Was it 8 to 9 years that you are with One Identity? Am I correct, Sekhan?
It's about 8 years now, correct? Yeah.
Okay. And you also consult a number of organizations in different industries. So today we have 4 industries that is signing up for today's webinar. We have financial services, governments, retail, as well as construction. Now, before we start, let's just have a few friendly chat. I can see people logging in for this webinar. Andrew, I mean, the last couple of months, there is a lot of cyber attack going on around the world. But in Australia, a number of companies not just attacked once, but attacked twice since January. And last week, one of the largest beverage company got attacked. And a lot of these attacks taking place because of majority of the IT security, all their employees are now working from home. And I don't think cyber attack will stop anytime soon. But how do we prepare going forward? Because I don't believe a number of people will just, I mean, or maybe in June or July, people will still starting to back to work. But work from home become a norm right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you said rightly, it's whether or not the volume has increased or the situation has changed or just the reporting, particularly in Australia with respect to breach notifications, has made us more aware of what's going on in there. There definitely has been an uptick. We will talk about this a little bit later on in the actual webinar itself, but one of the biggest factors for that actually happening is there is a user population that was used to working in this trusted 4 walls of the office, and there are technologies in place that can mitigate a lot of the risks around these external threats. A lot of these ones, particularly with respect to one of my favorite beverage manufacturers that is referenced there. There was also BlueScope Steel, and I believe also Toll has been quite publicly hit with ransomware. And these types of attacks are very much around the social engineering side of things and phishing attacks. And what we're doing is we've got a population of workforce individuals that had worked in this trusted environment. They're now outside of that trusted environment. All of those controls are gone, and they're behaving as they were in a trusted environment. So that there's some techniques we'll talk about a little bit later as to how we move away from trusting that thick wall perimeter into more of what we'll refer to as a zero trust model, where we know more about who the individual is. We'll ensure that they operate in a more safe and secure manner, and tooling that takes some of that, some of the assumptions they have and take some of the decision making we put on them and their responsibilities away, so as that they don't expose the organizations to these types of threats. Right.
Now, here's the challenge. Because of this particular crisis, a number of organizations have strapped a big chunk of their workforce. And some of this workforce are from IT, and some are obviously from different departments and such. Now, when it comes back to rebuilding the organizations, etc., and that sort of thing, usually security is not their top priority. Costs and how to make more money, or basically building more product, or be more performance-led company is basically their top priority, because that's what most of the organizations are thinking. So this question is for you. I mean, how do organizations prepare for the, I guess, a newer environment moving forward?
Actually, points there as well. When the thing with security, right? If you actually if you look at security, if you do it properly, it can actually help speed up in a lot of that transitioning back to whatever that new normal will be, or moving employees, or whatever you're going to do, right, to be able to get back into an operational state. If you break it down and you look at some of the things that you need to do to be able to enable that, and we're going to get through some of this today in today's session as well, when we get through, I guess, what some of these changes actually mean. But really, it's about having that identity-centric approach to your security strategy. And when you actually look at this and you do it properly, it will help your business. It will be a business enabler. It will remove some of those frictions, all those typical frictions that were there in the past. And instead of security being that department of no kind of approach, it will become more of that organization, that unit within your team that will be able to help the other areas of your business and your operations.
Okay. Now, because of the world change and, frankly, the entire world kind of change as well in terms of how we do business, etc. and sort of thing. And the last 4 or 5 months, number of people working from home, organization are now rethink, do we need a full-time workforce? Can we adopt the gig economy model where work or project are outsourced to different organizations or country or anything like that? And with this poses a lot of challenges with access and identity management. So, Andrew, this question is for you. I mean, how do we, manage that?
Look, I would say that the problem space has been with us for quite some time. Whether or not we talk about outsourcing, we talk about bringing on contractors, etc., managed service providers, and we need to provide people access to environments to deliver on a certain set of services in a controlled manner and then be able to get them back out again. That problem's been around for quite a time. So I don't think that in itself is something that is any different to what we've seen before. Right? Whether or not the engagements aren't years or 3 months, but now they're much shorter, they could be a week or a day or whatever it is from that gig economy side of things. And this is definitely something that Sir can probably back me up on, is more around how we have the systems in place whereby we ensure that those individuals or the gig economies, those contractors come in, only get the rights to be able to deliver on the services they're contracted to deliver. They only have them for the period of time that they require them, and then once they no longer require that we ensure that the system is put back into a state whereby they don't have access to that information anymore. Right? From my side of the world, I'm all around ensuring that we have contextual authorization, that we know who the individual is, but it is really foundated, or the foundation of it is based on that the systems are in place to ensure that those people are only getting access to the systems for the period of time that they have that relationship.
Yeah, add on to that, like when you talk about that gig economy with freelancers, the whole value of that is to be able to bring in these additional resources to support whatever project, initiative, outcome that you're trying to achieve, right? And when you bring these resources on for a short period of time, generally, so as part of that, you want to make sure that they have the access that they need the moment they start. You don't want to waste any time, right? Because that's just lost productivity there. So they need to be able to have that access immediately. You need to be able to make sure that they log in securely, their passwords are all set up correctly. They might be using some MFA process as part of that as well, especially now, right, to make sure they're logging in correctly. But also when they leave, when their contract is up, that freelance, that resource is no longer required as part of the team or as part of the project. At the same time, you want to make sure their access is deprovisioned immediately, not a week later.
Yeah, and a lot of times, just to add to that, is that we're going to have a discussion a bit later on around zero trust. And one of the biggest factors with these, and you mentioned absolutely right, Sir Ken, is that when I'm bringing in a freelancer in that space, I don't have a space in anymore. I don't have a corporate laptop. I've got to get it provisioned with all the IT assets in it that I can share with them. They will then run the old days where I had my laptop and my work laptop and never the shame cell that will meet. That I will need to ensure that they are utilizing their systems, their software to access my resources. So I really want to tie it down to ensure that I know who it is, what they're trying to access, and they only get access to the systems that they're allowed to deliver that purpose, as you said, Sir. And that has to be support that agile methodology that everybody wants to enable at the moment.
Yeah, you bring up a good point. It's basically the agility of the business right now. We will kickstart now. Since that we have almost 50 something now live. Before we basically kickstart, there's one statement that with all these cyber attacks that happened recently, it's actually more than ever. A CISO was saying that password is easy to crack. It's nothing new. Credential and identity are easy to be stolen. And CISO, obviously, endpoint is important to protect. But one of the crucial security elements is identity access management. Without that, your whole IT security could fail. How do you agree with this statement? Because some people won't.
So sure, yeah, well, that one's second.
Yeah, I'll probably take that one. I do, absolutely. So if you're just relying solely on a password to be able to solely on a user account and their credential and a password to be able to protect your application and your data, there's a lot of risk in that approach, right? Because that becomes the only control point that you now have. And that's why you'd adopt technologies like multi-factor authentication to increase that from the initial authentication side. But you also need to be looking at the actual access management around the authorization side of it as well. And by using identity technologies there, you could actually be controlling who has access to which data, to which application, what roles, responsibilities, and authorities that a user holds within any given application. So as to be breached, however the breach occurs, whether it's a social engineering, it's a phishing scam, or whatever it happens to be, then the actual risk of that is constrained to a very small area, hopefully, right? When you've got this set up correctly versus what could be the potential damage there.
Yeah, and specific to your question around passwords, it's interesting that the most secure systems in the world, a lot of the PKI-based systems, which are seen as being, from a cryptography perspective, one of the better ways to authenticate someone. When you break it all the way down, it's still a PIN or a password that actually secures the core keys associated with that, right? So, one of the cheapest ways to authenticate someone is a password, but it will expose and undermine everything you've done from an infrastructure perspective. The problem with passwords has been solved a long time ago, and should be resolved now with at least multi-factor. Now, multi-factor is a great one to add friction when you need it, to ensure that those, if those passwords are compromised, that we have the ability to have those been compromised. But going forward, we see these issues around passwordless now, right? Which is a new paradigm, getting down to the desktop, whereby we want to ensure that we have a user experience whereby we're just going to hit them straight up front for something that's more unique, stronger than actually passwords in general. So there's nothing to be able to steal at all.
Okay. I have one thing I'd like to challenge both of you. Now, businesses is going to basically revive, rebuild, and stuff like that. Cost is a major concern. Now, the security guy is going to come to you and say, hey, look, why do we need to spend more money on IAM if we can just use Active Directory?
Okay. Ooh, do you want to start? I was going to say, why do I spend more money? Because that's how I get paid. But specific to AD, go for it. Huh?
Yeah. So you're right. Look, when you talk about Active Directory is a very key system for a lot of organizations. It underpins the access for your workstations. Your servers are connected into this thing. You've got various applications. But AD is not your whole central identity system, right? It's a very important piece of it, correct? A lot of systems are relying on that for authentication. But when you talk about a identity-centric security strategy or doing identity governance and those type of proper processes around that, it's more than just user accounts and group memberships and passwords. There's a lot more at play here that you need to be able to control. Adding processes such as attestation and recertification type capability is key. That's with AD, you add people into an application or you add them into a group, but there's no method there to be able to say, should Serkan still be a member of this group? Does Serkan still need access to this data, to this file share, to this application? That's what identity governance is actually about, and being able to do that. Then you take it a little bit further and then you apply what we call like segregation of duties or compliance rules on top of that. So what you're looking for is that toxic combination. If Serkan is a member of Group A and Group B, then his account, one, is very high risk now because he's got a lot of access. And if his account was to be compromised, then the potential that it has there from a risk perspective is huge. So that's the kind of identity to add.
No, I was just going to add and say that just from my experience, Active Directory is an exceptionally good network operating system to be able to centralize group management policies, to be able to handle a single place to manage, what can be tens of thousands of endpoints that are running the Microsoft operating system. Perfect for that. And if your entire environment is built on Microsoft, There's no SAP, there's no mainframe, there's no legacy Oracle, there's none of that stuff out there at all. Perfect, does it really, really well. As soon as you start to work into a heterogeneous environment whereby we've got different access points, we've got VPNs, we've got cloud-based systems, we've got all of this old infrastructure that is just laying around. AD in itself will work in the Microsoft world. We need to go outside of that to be able to fit that sort of now more going into the hybrid environment as well.
With that note, I believe that both of you have presentations and also discussions that you're going to go through a bit more depth on how to basically bounce back from disruptions, as well as the changing workforce economy. Can we give a welcome applause to Serkan, who's going to do his first presentations. Just basically clap so he doesn't feel a bit lonely just talking by himself with the computer.
No, that's okay. So I think my screen sharing should now be set up all correctly. I might just get started on today's one. I think we've already just gone through a quick introduction. Hi, everyone. Serkan Seaton. I'm actually based out of Sydney in Australia. And today we also have Andrew with us as well. Andrew,
you're here then.
Yeah. Cool. So with some of the stuff that we're going to talk through, I guess at the beginning, we're just going to talk about some of the change that we've had to go through over the last couple of months. It's impacted every organization, whether you've had to, unfortunately, in some cases, some organizations had to lay off some of their staff. In many organizations, they put employees on like a bit of a standby or an unpaid leave type arrangement. We've pretty much all transferred to remote. I think most organizations are still on 100% remote type work arrangement. I know that we are, for example, like internally within our company, we're looking at being remote up until around September. Not so much of a challenge for me, I suppose. I've been remote for a very long time, so I'm quite used to working from home. I am missing the airport. I haven't traveled in a while, so looking forward to it opening up. And one of the other challenges, I guess one of the other things that we've seen, some of the other changes that we've seen is in some industries, we've seen a lot of hires or like the temporary hires or transfers across department entities or teams or different business units as part of the organization. So there's been a lot of different, so it's for everyone, for every organization, it's been a different view there. And really, none of this was planned for, right? We didn't have a process or we didn't have a book on, that we're going to plan for any of this. But from when you look at some of those changes that we've had to implement on our staff, a lot of it is actually back to the identity joiner, mover, leaver processes, right? Whether we're hiring additional staff or augmenting our existing team or transferring our teams to now support an additional area, such as a call center, which may be seeing a high amount of incoming calls due to people looking for assistance for your services. Or it might be some of the lever processes to be able to actually deactivate some accounts and put people on standby and terminate some of the accounts that are there. A lot of this is just about the identity provisioning processes, right? In a survey that we did, that we'd recently conducted, it was about 1,000 identity professionals globally. 18% of those practitioners responded that they actually have the right tools, the right identity and access management, the identity governance tools, to do what it takes to fully provision a user account within minutes. So the other way to look at that, it's only 82% who can actually provision an account. For the 82%, it takes them hours, days, weeks, or longer than that to be able to actually provision an account. Now, that's on the provisioning side, right? And then you can say, well, there's lost productivity. It takes a bit longer. Instead of minutes, it might take a day, it might take 2 days. You got to look at the deprovisioning side of this as well. When we looked at the deprovisioning part of it, only 28% reported that they actually have the tools in place to be able to deprovision a user access within minutes. So 72% took longer than that. And when you're looking at about IT security and risk, that when an employee leaves your organization, one of the first things you need to do within minutes, is deactivate their account, make sure their access is disabled, their accounts are deactivated, right? So anything more than a minute is a risk. just to add on to it, then we asked a little bit about how people actually do it. So what are some of the processes and tools that they're using from the respondents who did have this capability? And it was only about a third who responded that they actually have the proper tools in place to be able to execute this timely, but also was complete. So out of the few that responded that they have the capability within minutes, only a third said that they actually have the proper tools in place and it was more complete. 37% said that they had the tool for AD, that they were able to handle this for AD. 33% of them said that they can do it for most of their on-prem applications, and only about 30% said that they have this capability for their cloud-based applications as well. So it comes back to what Andrew actually talked about earlier as well, with with a heterogeneous IT environment where it's not just about AD, it's you have other applications and systems and processes, and really you need to find a consistent way to be able to manage that. Bottom line that came out of this survey of organizations are simply not well equipped. So let's have a look at some of the change that may be enforced upon you. If you have a step back and just have a think about some of the changes that your organization has had to go through in the last few months, whether it's transitioning from your offices and moving everybody to a remote arrangement, or maybe you've had to put a high number of workers on a standby and unpaid leave, or you've had to terminate more employees than what you'd want to, right? So we've all had different types of that change that's been forced upon us as part of this. Just some question, how did you think you went? How did you think you actually, how did you go with it? Was it a good experience? Was it a bad experience? Were you able to handle some of these challenges that got thrown at you? And I think the bottom line for a lot of organizations is that we just did the best that we could with the cards that we've been dealt, right? We had a situation that we had to deal with, and to make sure it can get done, to make sure that our business can continue to operate, to make sure that our environments were secure, or as secure as possible. That involved a lot of long hours. For many people, it involved long hours, all-nighters, weekend work, whatever it was that we had to just actually make it happen, right, and just move on with it.
So, Serkan, if I can just interject there, you mentioned something that was really important, and that was as people are adopting SaaS and cloud-based systems, let's say it's Salesforce or whatever it might be, that shadow IT of just turning on services. One of the things you mentioned there is about when you've got the systems internally and you've got to go through the right IT environment and through the CIO-based system, you've got all the checks and balances in for creating and removing accounts. A lot of the single sign-on technologies, particularly in Salesforce, will do what we call just-in-time provisioning. We'll create the account, but there's no way to remove them. And when it's without the proper IT and the systems in place, you get these accounts being created out in third-party systems. There's no way to reconcile that against whether or not they actually need it anymore. And that's a huge piece that you mentioned there.
Mate. Yeah, definitely. So let's have a look at some of the challenges, I suppose, that we've faced. Like I was saying earlier, these have been unprecedented events, right? It's not like we had a book that we just had to dust off the cover and just pull out, and this was a whole procedure and a manual on how we had to do that. There was just a lot of heavy amount of IT invention involved. And because it was unprecedented, we're just really figuring it out. A lot of IT organizations were just trying to figure this out as they moved along, just one challenge at a time, one hurdle at a time, and as they progress through that. A lot of these challenges, well, some of these actually can lead or have led to human error in some of these as well, right? Because, and inconsistency, because everybody does things slightly differently. If you ask two different IT administrators or two different teams to do a particular task, they're going to take a different approach with how they do that, right? Any of these type of human errors or just comes back to risk, whatever it may be. Risk got to do with the way that the accounts were set up. It may be an excessive amount of access. It may be just basic things like the naming convention wasn't done correctly, right? And then you got to think about, well, we went through all that effort and all that trouble to go and implement all those changes, right? We went through those long hours, went through the all-nighters, the weekends, right? Call in additional teams and resources and our outsourced service providers to help us out with this. Then what do we do when we have to change it back again, right? Or what do we do when we change it again as part of whatever the new normal is?
Right. So, look, one of the things that we've sort of mentioned here, and it was alluded to a bit around the concept, the comment about SaaS and cloud, is that as part of a lot of this change that we've seen, we saw it back in Y2K, we saw it around SARS and a bunch of incidents that have happened, which have caused organizations to put their BCP in place to allow people to connect to internal resources from, if they have a situation where they can't get into the office, right? So we've had those in place, but what was different recently was the rate in which we had to do it. And we've also seen some strategies and things change historically, and it's been happening for a long time now, where we traditionally had this perimeter, the firewall type approach to locking away all of our important assets internally, and then basically if you're on one side of the wall, you're trusted. If you're on the other side of the wall, you're not. But that's been breaking down, particularly as I mentioned before about these cloud first initiatives, where those corporate assets, they may be hosted externally, but they are still your assets. They're valuable to you, and you've got to protect them. So that perimeter changed. I'll introduce some terms like zero trust in a second. Sorry, I've got an automatic thing that moves that across. If you can just go back just quickly there, Serkan. Yeah, from a zero trust, I'll go into zero trust in just a second, a little bit later. But look, if we have a look at what's happened recently, is the mass user population that used to work in a trusted environment with corporate assets around those firewalls, content filtering, and put them out into environments whereby that's not in place. They're still operating as they did before. They just haven't been told and taught how to work remotely. We've got a group of people that are still using passwords to access systems where in the past they were internally, and we could trust the environment they're in. We can't trust that anymore. So we do need to provide a better way to identify people from systems that we don't know anymore. So it could be their own laptops, their own PCs, etc. So we're more interested in who the person is behind the machine. As I said, and from a zero trust perspective, extending on that is we can't trust the fact that that user is actually in the corporate environment on a corporate laptop using corporate network. So therefore we have to basically check and validate through contextual authorization, and based on what they're trying to do, and bring all of these factors together to determine whether or not we're going to allow access to an environment or we aren't. So if we have the next slide there, when we talk about the new perimeter, I mentioned before, the perimeter of the past was very much like a wall around a castle. Once you basically said, I am who I am, and you got full carte blanche access. So it was usually based on IP addresses. But as I mentioned before, we've talked about the cloud migration side of things. I can't believe today how many organizations still continue to get breached by just moving simple things like using Office 365. It's an external asset. It's basically remote access into systems, and it has some of the most sensitive information in an organization that people don't run multi-factor on that. We talk about BYOD. You need a way that you cannot trust the desktop or the endpoint the user's connecting from. We need to know who it is that's behind the device. When we talk about remote access, again, it's not a new problem, but it's now a greater problem. So the actual attack footprint of an organization is so much greater. And it's one of the biggest issues with there is not so much the systems that are in place, but the users that are now using it aren't familiar with it, haven't been educated. They don't know what's expected of them. And one of the areas we won't go into now, but it's something to think about as people start to move to this API-centric approach, that in itself requires a zero trust model as well. And that I've got my API gateway and everything behind that is all good and well, that we're now allowing third-party systems to connect and get direct access to the corporate information without basically an application in front of it, and just exposing it out like a free reign on a back-end database of just corporate assets. And that in itself needs a better way to understand what are the services that are consuming those APIs, who's actually at the end of that consumption point and traveling that all the way through. So the big thing is that the perimeter is now no longer around the firewall. It's no longer the endpoint. It's actually the user that sits behind that as to where the perimeter is.
Absolutely. And, when we think about a lot of our organizations, like just to paint a very, a sample scenario over here, just take a fictitious company. A lot of organizations actually will fall into this. They'll have, say 10,000 employees, but out of out of their current employee population, there's only going to be a small subset who are currently designated as being remote employees, right? And what we mean by remote employees, there's a whole HR process that needs to get involved in this as well. So they're designated as remote within HR. They get enabled and they get added into additional groups and resources and all that kind of stuff, right? It goes into that. We'll just say that this organization, they're a worldwide presence. They've got 4 primary locations. So the remainder of that, the other 90% of their employee base is based out of the 4 walls, right? The old perimeter. So they're within our corporate office blocks. And they use obviously a handful of corporate applications and systems that are, some tied into Active Directory and others may not be. They're using obviously cloud applications and cloud systems such as Microsoft 365 and whatever else that they're using, right? That they have in there. And then that's when the change happens, right? We've got that abrupt change to the business process where we've had to move the 90% now, the traditional who were within our 4 walls within the old perimeter. We now have to move all those guys home to be able to, and not just move them home, but make sure that they can continue still operating and supporting your business, that business continuity, while they're now working from home, working from their lounge rooms or their dining rooms or wherever they're working from, right? And how do you do it? There's a whole challenge that's going to come through there. Well, there's a whole challenge that comes through that. For a lot of organizations, actually, this has actually been about enabling. When you think about it, it's been about enabling the remainder or all of our employees, the 90%, to now be able to go home, work from home, take their devices, whatever they need with them, or work from their own personal devices, depending on how you've set it up currently. But making sure that they're enabled within the correct applications, the systems that they need to be. When you look at it from a IT or from an application perspective on some of the effort that was involved, to be able to enable people to become remote, it's a change on the HR side, because now you need to actually say that these 9,000 people are now designated as being remote employees as well. So it's a mass change over there. Then it's also another mass change on the AD side or any other application groups. You might have to reset their accounts, their passwords. You might have to add them into additional applications or additional systems. Like we talked about earlier, you might take a subset of employees from an existing team or from a division, agency, department, however it's structured, and move them over to support another area of the business, which has been seeing a high demand, such as call centers, for example, right? So depending on whatever industry or whatever organization that is, with a lot of that, there's actually been a lot of challenges, not just from the actual automation, not just from the process of creating user accounts and adding accounts into groups and roles and all the membership changes. Also, there is a change to the authentication process as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And as mentioned right up front is, and I also like, we'll talk a little bit more around the architecture methodologies around how we implement this side of things. But as I mentioned up front, is the fundamental thing with all of this is we've taken staff very rapidly, and like if it gets in the way, you bypass it. That's my cynical sense of the way I've seen things happen. When we talk about DevOps and SecOps, the biggest issue in all of that is how you actually get changes through in an automated way, in a controlled way, a repeatable way, without just bypassing it. And this is generally what we've seen happen with these types of incidents where we need to make things happen quickly. The standard efforts put around ISMS systems, you've got policies, procedures, you've got tools, all those things tend to get left behind purely, as mentioned before. We need the business to run. We need these people to connect. And in a lot of the instances, it's a risk decision as to whether or not we will just go straight ahead and do it. So one of the challenges in all this side of things of taking this mass, as we mentioned before, this 90% of the population of the staff outside the corporate firewall, we've still got these passwords that the users are using. They're not used to using stronger forms of authentication. There's a lot of challenges about how I get them a level of authentication that's appropriate for the access that we're giving them, particularly from an external untrusted device and an untrusted network, and they need core. Right. And the other one too is that there are risk decisions that can be made. That if I can identify that there is a staff member that just so happens to be in the environment and there are staff around them that can see them from a corporate-owned machine, I can determine how I'm going to authenticate them differently than from when they're on the outside. One of the biggest ones that we're seeing at the moment is what we call geovelocity, which is, it is physically impossible for someone within 5 minutes to log in from New York and then log in from Sydney. So it's starting to take this contextual data that if they're moving from a different device, to make sure that we really identify who they are.
Or just to add even to that, is that employee even employee who's based out of Sydney, or are they based out of New York? So adding that context, like you said, is very important.
Yeah, correct. Bringing some of the geo and spatial data in there as well. All right, so just mentioning zero trust. So one of the things, just to start off with zero trust, and just want to just complete that slide, I'll talk to it. From a zero trust perspective, I'd like to change the name of zero trust to no longer assume trust. It is a big one here. So, one of the problems we do have, role-based access control, is trying to quantify, trying to group people into common sets of attributes, and based on those attributes, then we give access, right? That let's not just straight off the back say they're an employee, they're in the office, they can do whatever they want, or they're an employee on a corporate laptop, go for it, you've got carte blanche. But what we want to do is really ensure that, based again on the context of what they're trying to do, where they're coming from, on each and every request, that we really ensure they are who they are. And that we look at where they're coming from, and that state that we have built an essential assurance level out of hasn't changed, right? That it is still the user. And even when you're talking about systems connecting to other systems, that we don't just trust the fact that it was an IP address to another IP address. Sorry, and I apologize if I really insult a lot of firewall people here, but the whole world now of having big access control lists of IP address to IP address, they've gone. Cannot do that anymore. The concept of segmentation networks is getting down to the point where essentially you should be able to take your internal H system, put it publicly out on the internet, and on its own it will protect itself. That's the new world and where we have to do it. And then we don't have another system primarily connecting to that. We just trust that other system. We have an individual or an authenticated service that we know exactly who it is. We know how we built the trust around that identity to determine whether or not it accesses that island that's out there in that angry world we call the internet. And as I mentioned before, is that through the process in which either the users or the systems are constantly throughout the day trying to access this information, that we are constantly verifying the fact that the context, the environment, the actual, the reasoning behind why that request is being made, that we actually have the ability to do things like step up an authentication, to terminate a session. We make sure that throughout that environment, that the trust we have established with that user at the end doesn't change. All right, so, and I think the last two slides I've got is, that this, I mentioned before, the flexibility, the dynamic approach. So I said, making sure that we take in not only where they're connecting from, that we understand that there is a risk decision behind this, and what they're actually trying to get access to, that we're taking triggers from inside. From a financial services perspective, there are real live trigger points around fraud, around risk, that we can take into that decision making as to whether or not we allow access. One of the coarse grain ones is said generally around known bad actors, known bad IP addresses, known bad behaviors. But as we start to move into more of an anomaly-based environment, a behavioral-based environment, really starting to bring in a lot of these factors as well. And I will say straight now, and this isn't just in the consumer space, I'm seeing a lot of the workforce and corporates do this as well, is historically it's about creating friction. It's about asking everything up front and making it difficult for staff. But I'm starting to see now a change where we're looking at things like passwordless, so as that we can go to a stronger factor up front. And as part of that, then we get the single sign-on off the back of that, where during the authentication state, we have a strong, high level of trust of the user. We can build trust in the actual environment they're in, the endpoint, so as that when they're bouncing around to different systems, they're not being reprompted. So it's actually, as mentioned before, Serkan, is that security in that instance becomes a business enabler, not just shutting things down. Right, into that one again, I mentioned before around seamless secure, I've mentioned zero friction experience. That's a lovely word. Omni-channel, all those types of things. But again, what's really important in this type of thing, and if I could just say that from a budgetary purpose, to how you actually get the funds and the attention from the board to allow you to do these initiatives, the worst thing you want is a breach or an audit failure to drive that budget. The best way to do it is start from the other side of things and say that if I have this security in here and look at the security systems and zero trust and the multi-factor I'm going to put in and passwordless up front, the experience to the users is such that their operational efficiency will go up And as a result of that, it will reduce costs and efficiency that will then fund the security project as well. So these are all important aspects around ensuring that that session.
Exactly, and also even just the back end data, how that has actually been controlled as well, with what applications and what data they access to, and the authorization that they have within each one of those, the roles and responsibilities that they hold, just controlling that back from a frictionless manner back to the end user. So it's all enabled and available to them on day one, not on day 10.
All right, so just an example here, and this is the last one I'll go through, is, as I mentioned before, the traditional model, particularly around authentication, is around that I've got a username and a password. Worst thing ever, passwords. Not only are they're cheap to set up, but very expensive to manage. Working with financial services here in Australia, one of the banks with just over 4 million users, every year they would get just over 1 million support calls just for password resets. At around $20 per cost associated with that, would actually fund 200 full-time employees just to do password resets. Mm-hmm. So if you can take away not only the security aspects of that, but the cost of managing, because it is very expensive ongoing, not only do you create a better trusted environment, but it is a better experience for the end user. And as we move across to the zero trust model, this let's not assume trust anymore. A lot of the times there is an identifier. There's actually a new initiative just for people who are interested in it called user nameless. So was that we can now get down to a pairing with a device, and that in a sense is my identifier, but then saying look at different forms of authentication based on the risk. The greatest one, everyone wants to have a chat about it. I'd love to have a beer with people and just go on and yak on for ages around FIDO as a method, but really starting to utilize the device that people have in their hands at the time as a contextual information, and then applying that to determine exactly down based on what the user has access to, how I'm going to authenticate them, from what environments to determine whether or not I allow that access or not. And that's where zero trust is. We want to make sure that the process by which I put together the authentication systems to authenticate the user builds a level of trust, so then I can then control that as it goes through to each of the individual systems, irrespective of where they're coming from.
And then when you can even add on to that even further is actually controlling the privileges that are held within each one of those systems and applications as well. And moving towards that model where you're implementing zero trust, but also enforcing least privileged access. So you're controlling and making sure that your end users only have access or the privileges that they need to perform their tasks and jobs and nothing else. Right. Yeah,
it's one of those funny ones that for years we talked about role-based access control, and a lot of people are doing it. I'm not sure I've seen anybody get successful, and I think we all moved over to attribute-based access control, I think is the new one in today's.
Yeah, exactly. It's been a challenging area for many people when they're dealing with RBAC. Yeah, seen all kinds of different things there with more roles and employees as well. So just to continue on this, and when you think about some of the change that we've gone through over the last few months, there is going to be some new normal, and maybe remote normal as well, right? So there will be another change that organizations will need to go and implement, or you've probably already started implementing as part of defining what this new normal will be within your organization. I know a couple of industries, for example, actually one in the beverages space, I suppose, around the supplying and selling of in the liquor and beverages space. A lot of field reps used to be out there traveling and traveling in between different sites, so different retail organizations, and promoting and selling their goods and services, promoting their product to different retailers, so different bottle shops, so they continue selling those, right? Over the last 4 or 5 months, though, that whole industry has been shooken up, and instead of the field person, the field rep now visiting people in person, they're doing that over Zoom calls or over Teams calls or any other video conferencing facility. So the organizations will be looking at, well, how do we adopt more of these type of technologies? How do we operate?
Yeah, as you said, Sirka, and unfortunately, I think like you, my lack of ability to get free food and alcohol at the airport lounges, I would really like to go back to the old normal. But yeah, 100%, there's going to be that flexibility to allow people to work from wherever they are, because they've proven the fact that they can.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a lower cost for the organization when you think about it as well, with travel and expenses. So it will be something that will change. And then let's just say we have to change again, right? Well, let's just add in another massive disruption, whatever the disruption is, whether it's another pandemic or it's something else, or it's a second wave, right? There's no simple undo button for any of this. There's no Control Z, right? You can't just undo whatever changes you had to implement and go back to the way that it was. There'll be more disruption that will be happening within the organization, back into HR team, back into the IT team. Really, it's just going to be a rinse and repeat of everything that we've just done manually. So we're back to those long hours, back to those rushed work. You know, we're skipping some of those processes, some of those T's and some of those I's. Probably haven't crossed every single one of them or dotted every single one of the I's, right? We're wasting a lot of effort. You know, it's a lot of wasted effort, and because of that, it's wasted money. We're losing productivity as part of this. There could be another way to do that. The inconsistency is actually leading into errors that are happening with the system, which just opens up another area of risk, right? Whether it be with the access that's been provisioning, excessive amounts of privileges that are being given out to users, because the fastest way is just to make everybody a domain admin, right? You know, that's the traditional approach. Whenever you're setting up a lab environment, you know, when you're building up a service account, just add them into the admins group because it's the fastest way to do it. And it got the job done, but just look at the risk that now has if every account is now a member of admins. So really, just to getting close to wrapping up, automated all of this. No, we've gone through this whole effort of doing a bulk provisioning and a bulk deprovisioning type of exercise. What if there is a way that we could have actually grabbed all these people, grouped them all together in this bucket, and then said massively add remote access, add them, enroll them all into multi-factor authentication, add this application or this privilege, this entitlement on bulk to these 500, 5,000 users, whatever it's going to be. But then if we have to remove it now, if we have to remove that application, like in that example where you've transitioned a subset of an organization, a subset of a team to support another business unit or another function like your call center, and now you need to transition them back again. So then deprovision it just as fast, right? What if before actually, instead of implementing these in your live production system at once like this, right, and having those potential risks there, what if you could actually stage it? Actually, you know, take everything, what you're going to do from all this provisioning and deprovisioning side, simulate it, test, see the results, see the report on what it's going to actually impact the end result. And if you're happy with it, schedule it and then deploy it. The results of where we'll actually be at is the change would become virtually instant. Very minimal IT intervention will actually be required. Everything's going to happen correctly. Right? It's going to be happening the way it's supposed to happen. Everything's going to be consistent. I'm a big fan of consistency. Everything's going to be done the exact same way. The access is all going to be secure. All the authentications, you know that it's all going to be secure because all the authentications are happening the same way. You've enforced multi-factor authentication. You're putting in things like, you know, all the conditional rules around the authentication authorization as well. And ultimately, it's going to eliminate all the risk. Right, for both sides of the equation, for all ends of it.
Yeah, I'd say to there as well is that, you know, with all of this is great opportunity, right, for the systems that you need to put in place to support this. You know, my space is said more around the access control and multi-factor authentication. That when organizations tend to think about, I've now got a remote workforce that needs to get into my assets externally that didn't have to in the past, I'm going to give them you know, different forms of authentication to protect that. But it does then give you the opportunity to leverage that investment across more to the environment that's not just remote access, right? So into those cloud systems, being able to you know, privilege user management. I don't know if anybody's involved in any things like the Essential 8. One of the biggest calls there from privilege user management is ensuring that, you know, what is essentially those admin accounts, that you've got at least strong authentication over the top of as well. So there's a lot of those, I think, initiatives that you've got that have been sort of sitting in the off to the side that you'd love to be able to implement, but haven't really had the budget or the impetus or, you know, the drive or priority to do it, to be able to take this as an opportunity to improve the security posture of the business.
All right, thank you so much, gentlemen. Thank you for the insights. We have a few questions that just came in. I've seen some just emailed to us. And gentleman here, James Houghton, posted a question here. Andrew and also Saka, can you see it?
I can.
Yeah. So is there any credible research presented to show that distributed working and additional control and resources is less costly than working in a traditional office environment?
Do you want that, Sirkan? I've got an answer, but if you want that.
If you got one, you feel free.
Yeah, sure. Well, my answer is I haven't seen the total cost of ownership numbers. There is definitely data available around the fact that I have staff at home, therefore generally the infrastructure required for them to sit at a desk, right? But that does require an organization during this period of time to reduce that cost, right? So if I've got, 1,000 square meters for 1,000 staff, very small, close proximity to each other, but let's just use that one. And then half my staff go work from home. I've got to reduce the size of that down to 500, right? So electricity, security, all of that does actually, provide a cost savings. That's just a known one. What's not known, and that I haven't seen, is around things like whether or not working from home is actually more operationally efficient, right? And so those sorts of numbers with respect to how much work someone actually gets done in the office versus remotely. Based on my experience, I swear I'm doing twice as much work as I ever did before, because I'm not disappearing off and having coffees with people, going off to the printer and all the rest of the stuff and just getting distracted. And I tend to work through lunch. So, those, I guess, not so much anecdotal, but the non-tangible data, I haven't seen data on, but definitely there is huge reductions in cost associated with the fact of not having to provide a permanent desk for an individual to be able to sit at. And it's usually around, I said, floor space rental, air conditioning, power, all that stuff, security guys down the front desk, all of those types of things as well.
You even just touched on something there, because I guess both you and I are remote employees normally, and we travel around from sites to visiting customers, visiting partners, all around globally, right? And now we're still doing the same work without necessarily being on a flight. So there is not the actual physical floor space and the air conditioning and electricity, but the actual travel cost is no longer there.
My frequent flyers are suffering, and therefore my family doesn't get around to fly around the country for free anymore, right? Yeah. So, but also I've noticed myself personally that those electrical bills and have actually come back onto me as the employer, as I'm working at home a lot more. I have a partner that works with me at home as well. So our general power has been, the cost associated with that has actually been passed on to me. What I have noticed, though, particularly in this issue we've had now around COVID, is the cost around OH&S just doesn't tend to have been thought about as much. I'm not getting people coming in checking that I'm sitting in the right position. Whether or not it was needed in the first place or not, I don't know. I can't challenge OH&S. But the cost associated with moving people out of the office, is definitely much less around infrastructure for sure.
Great. Well, thank you so much. The second question is actually, this is for Sirkan. How would organization measure return of investments for an automated solution versus manual approach for provisioning and deprovisioning?
I think this question might actually tie back into a little bit of the previous one as well, is because when we look at, for example, return on investment, we've done a study on this, and we've got some calculators and things like that that are available online that we can share the link to. But when we look at this, we look at what's the actual effort that's required, not just from an IT side, but also from other areas like HR side, in making the change on the HR system to, let's say, now designate that employee as working from home. So we send the OH&S officer to make sure Andrew's sitting correctly, or I'm sitting correctly, right? But also all the IT side's got to go with that. So provisioning of the access and so on. And let's just say for every employee, each one of these tasks takes approximately 5 minutes, and let's say you've got, to do, right? So that's about 50 minutes for each person. And now times up by the number of employees you have and the frequency in which you need to go and do that, that will really quickly give you the cost of what it's taking your organization, right? Because every task, every minute is obviously associated against somebody's hourly rate. So you can, get that cost quite easily from there. And now when you go and implement an actual identity automation or identity solution, not going to downplay that there is obviously an additional cost in being able to set one of these things up, right? There is a project that's going to be involved, and depending on complexities and things like that, it could be X duration or it could be Y duration. We don't know what that will be yet. But yes, there will be that additional cost involved. But where you will see the benefits is actually not on day one. You will see the cost or the ROI over a period of time, and that's normally around that 2-3 year type of area where you will see that.
Okay, I guess like every planning, actually they have to plan for the future, not just for this crisis disruption. Andrew, there's a question. I relook at your slide about zero trust. There's so many things to consider when planning zero trust model. Where should we start? Or where should the IT staff start?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say, and this is for anything to do with security, and I think I saw a question there somewhere around something like the Essential 8 and how we implement that. Look, I was taught a long time ago, and we would have heard it also from guys like Bruce Schneier, one of the great guys in security. Yeah, he made the comment about security is not a product, right? It's a process. I also believe it's also a people, because you need the people and the mindset around it as well. But if we talk about security in general, it is an exercise in risk management. That's all it is, right? I need to understand the value of what I'm protecting. I need to understand the cost associated with protecting it. I need to understand the likelihood of there's a breach or there's an issue with access to that information. And I choose the appropriate controls that go into place to mitigate that risk to a level I'm willing to accept. It's pretty simple. So look, when it comes to a zero trust product in the first instance, so to get this working is to get those in the organization to understand that it's something they have to invest in is the first thing. If you don't get anything to do with security, irrespective of what it is, out of the security team, out of basically the CIO and get it up to a board level, a C-level discussion, you're going to go nowhere. So the first thing is to be able to articulate the value of zero trust to the business. And it needs to be in a sense of, either it's going to increase profitability or reduce cost to the business, right? So revenues and costs for profitability. Once you get to that point, you can look to audit, but there's also around that. You can look to breaches, you can look at all that FUD related stuff. But if you can actually turn around and say what the value to the business is, that's the first thing to go with. And once you've got that corporate, that corporate support from the top down, that they're going to be able to support initiatives, funding, projects, etc., then you can start to do some research out and find some people in the industry who've done it before. Don't learn it yourself. One of the things I've learned very, very early on is a lot of this stuff is the technology stuff is all commodity based. How to implement it within the budget that you've got to go forward. So if I'd say anything off, build your business case and get top level down support and funding to actually do it right.
Okay.
I know the answer was go and buy a product and install it, but sorry, from my perspective, information security management, right, a person for 20 years, it won't go anywhere unless you get that top level down support.
Absolutely. It doesn't matter which product you go with.
Okay, let's just answer a couple of 3 more questions from the audience. And James Woolen again. I'm sure you guys can also see the questions. What do you think has been the greatest challenge towards the implementation of E8 initiative? We've seen some pretty disappointing results from the organization themselves. So what chance the rest of us?
Yeah, sorry a second. I sort of alluded to that just a second ago. The Essential 8, for those people who don't know, is there used to be, I think it was 10 or 13 in the past, but they brought it down to 8. Is basically a federal government initiated set of security control, recommended, enforced, audited to be in place to provide the greatest impact for your effort, right? So things like, and my favorite one is whitelisting, right? Let's lock the environment down. It's almost to the old days where we used to have air gap. Right? If it's not connected to the network, it's not an issue, right? But in this instance here, whitelisting is just lock the environment down. So it was, because one of the biggest issues with respect to anything about introducing a vulnerability into an environment is to make a change. So if it doesn't change, then in theory, it just keeps going forward, right? So what I would say to answer that question, greatest challenge is, unless I am in federal government where I'm going to be audited against these things, use them as a reference point. Make risk decisions as to whether or not they are applicable and whether or not you want to invest in them. Same things with ISO 27001. If I don't need to comply to it, if there's no framework or regulation that I have to hold up a piece of paper and say, here, I paid some money and I do this every year, then look at it as a reference point and pick the good things out of it. I would suggest that don't apply everything. So pick the things. I worked in a critical infrastructure organization where they did implement the essential aids and no one got any work done. They locked it down too much because it didn't support their business. Make a decision, determine what is important to the business. What do you protect to actually protect that? And as I said, pick the eyes out of it, the things that make sense to you. But yeah, I'd say what chance do the rest of us have if the federal guys have issues with it? None in Buckley's, I think my father told me. You'll never get the whole lot implemented because your business will grind to a halt. Right? Pick out the stuff that makes sense, do the risk assessment, and then prioritize the things that have the greatest impact for the least amount of cost.
Okay. Now there's two more questions. So how important do you see HR system integration to an RBAC environment?
For an RBAC, so role-based access control. I think it's really important actually, because one of the, what HR systems are able to provide us is that organizational contextual information, right? Because what we're interested in is not just about the user's first name, but also what do they do within your company, which department, which location, what's their role, who's their manager, all that organizational contextual data, who they are, what they do, their relationships to other people in the organization, in the company as well, right? Their team that they're a part of. All that data actually helps in defining some of the roles-based access control models that you might want to implement. And when you go with RBAC, I've seen approaches where we try to define a role for every kind of variation of that. Now, what I try to actually suggest to a lot of our organizations that we work with is don't just try to define a role for every kind of variation. You're never going to get there. You're going to end up with more roles than you're going to have people. And then you've got another thing to go and manage. And it's just going to be even more complicated. The beauty of what helps with taking the HR data, that organizational contextual data, is that you can now define birthright access based on that. So it's still built on the concept of roles-based access control, but without necessarily having to. So if I've got the HR information around, this is my department called IT, and everybody in my IT department needs access to these applications, you can then define those as being birthright. So when you transition out of that, if an employee transitions from that department and goes to another, they move from location, let's say they move from Sydney to Melbourne or to Canberra or wherever it is, then you can automatically provision and deprovision access based on that birthright control access model, versus having to go and create all these different variations, permutations of roles and try to manage that, right? Because that's just another complexity on its own. So yeah, HR information, a lot of great value that can be taken from that, a lot of ways that you can apply that into your RBAC models or into your roles, or not call it roles-based access control, but into your access control model and your access control framework, just to make it a little bit more generic. But yeah, value there.
Okay.
And now, just so I just say from an experience I saw in a bank, when you are doing that, make sure that when you go down your thing, because generally a lot of them you've got one at the bottom that actually has a place card to go when it doesn't match. I just saw a bank deprovision 40,000 staff because it fell down the bottom, said you don't have any rights anymore. So from an experience perspective, definitely make sure you've tested all of those role things to what actually happens when a role never comes out.
Now, the technology actually in this space has come a bit of a way as well, and in the past, you're right, a lot of people used to code this as being if then case statements and stuff like that. Where I find some organizations want to go into is making it more data-driven, right? So when you get data-driven, then you're not programming this, you're not coding it up. It actually just becomes configuration. So it becomes just as dynamic and just as fluid as what your organization is. So if you split departments, merge departments together, whatever you do, you can also control your access control model, your birthright access, just through that whole data-driven model as well.
Beautiful.
Okay. Andrew, we did actually ask the audience for 1 hour of the time. We have running out a bit of time. So we have two questions. What do you see the three major organizations would do post-COVID and ID? Who want to take
Oh, geez. I went to the pub. First thing I did. Oh, you got some thoughts on that, Sir Ken? I've started to see what some are doing.
I'm just looking at the question now, and I'm just trying to think of 3 top major things.
What are you thinking?
It's got to be about making it easier to actually provide that access, right? You know, having those processes in place that, you know, when we're talking about that remote working model, I think a lot of organizations are going to look at, well, why haven't we been doing this in the past? You know, what's been stopping us from doing this? And how can we make this part of our new normal? I don't know what the arrangement will be for your specific organization, but, you know, maybe you'll go 2 days remote, 3 days office, or the other way, whatever makes sense. But I think that's got to be one of the main things that many companies are going to be looking at right now.
Yeah, the one I've seen a lot is rescoping roles that were thought to have to be in the office to being more flexible and optional. I think that's an important piece. I think that people have learnt that staff don't have to sit in their seat and be seen in the office to be seen as being valuable, right? So I see a lot of that happening. Although what I would say is that I think that what you'll find is organizations will actually move to more of almost a hot desking scenario, where rather than actually having a permanent seat available for an individual, then giving them flexibility to work from where they want to and not using it most of the time, that it'll be more what the IBMs and the HPs of the world have done, Sun have done in the past with large user populations, that there will be less floor space. And only those that are critical that actually require it will come in and they'll drive that. And you'll have the people that are so used to liking that environment to work in that will permanently come back. But for those with options, I think that's what you'll start to see is updating policies that change roles where they weren't listed specifically as you have an option to work from home, that will then come in employment contracts where you can choose when and where you want to work. Is one of the big things that I'm starting to see at the moment. Mm-hmm. From that side of things. And I honestly do think that rapidly you're going to find a bunch of OH&S people come running around. Not that I've got anything against OH&S, but you're going to see a lot of chairs being purchased and people turning up and measuring backs and where hands are on keyboards, just purely because of the legalities that happen behind that of not providing a safe working environment. So that's another big one that's going to have a big catch up on as well.
And this one, I think only you can, or maybe you both can answer. What makes your zero trust model unique or different from competitors?
That's interesting. So I'm going to say straight off the bat that I don't do anything different to zero trust than anyone else does, because zero trust isn't a product, it's an approach, it's a methodology, it's an architecture, right? I do have products at Ping that fit into that mold, but like anything to do with compliance and audit and those things, you don't install Ping products and you don't install One Identity products to get a tick box to say it's an overarching framework. It's a support from top down. It's people, process, and technology to address that. And honestly, if somebody did come to me and ask about, I need someone to help me with my zero trust model, I would probably point them to one of our partners who's actually involved and has a greater view across the ecosystem beyond just what we do at Ping, because I've only got a little bit that fits into pieces. So when someone actually does get their model together and starts to identify pieces where they do need a technology to mitigate and implement those security controls, that's where I can come and have a chat to you to say this is where we fit into that. But generally from a zero trust perspective, I don't differ for anybody else because it's an approach and a methodology.
Right. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Sekant. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for attending today's webinar. Just to recap, I live in Hong Kong, and the property prices here, rent is crazy. I think only billionaire can live here now these days.
I was going to say you're actually presenting from your bathroom, kitchen, and
exactly. This is my 300 square feet apartment. I'm joking. James actually raised up a good point about cost and anything like that. I've seen a lot of organizations just give up their lease, or when their lease is up, they're not going to sign anymore. They adopt this remote working mentality, giving a freelancer outsourcing just to survive as a business. And with that, identity access management play a vital role in this particular process. Would that be ongoing? Is that a trend? I'm not so sure, but we'll continue to update everyone that's signed in today. And feel free to visit our website and also Ping Identity website and One Identity website. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you so much for today's webinar and insight. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thanks all.
Have a good day.